Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. I'm Charles Williams, and together we'll explore untold stories, bold ideas, and innovative approaches that transform our schools and communities. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. As always, thank you so much for rejoining me in this space. If you're watching this, you're going to notice a different setup because this is the first time in the new space. So very excited to have this new format, this new space. Still my office, just rearranged it, that's all. But with that, I'm excited. Not only do I got to be in this space, but I get to connect with somebody that I've been waiting to. When I had the opportunity to connect, I was like, man, this is phenomenal. And coming straight out of Philly. And before you get too excited, it's not like Quincy, it's not Abbott Elementary. Though Quincy, if you're listening for some reason, just know that I want to get you on the show or any of the cast for Abbott. But I have one of the phenomenal educators coming out of Philly. So joining me today is Ishmael Jimenez. And man, I cannot wait to dive in. I wish we had started clicked recording, a while back, because even just our pre-conversation, I was like, ooh, this is going to be good. So Ishmael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, man. Glad to have this type of conversation. It's always good to speak truth with fellow folks dedicated to such.
Yeah, I really think that this is going to be one of those, so if you're listening right now, make sure you have a bottle of water, an extinguisher, something, because every once in a while, these episodes get really, really hot. And I feel like this is going to be one of those. So before we jump in, Ishmael, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, the route you've taken, a little bit about what you do?
Yes. So I am a long-term educator in Philadelphia. I knew since I was 16 that I wanted to become a teacher, even though I graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA and everybody telling me, are you sure college is right for you? But I knew from a young age that I loved education, but I didn't really like school. And I know a bunch of kids like that love to think and love to learn and love to engage, but are never placed in that position in a school setting to actually do that in a real authentic way. And so once I found out that, hey, I can also do the thinking thing in the traditional sense, I knew that I wanted to become a teacher specifically in Philadelphia, and specifically for the required African-American history course that Philadelphia was the first in the country to have. So just naturally came, I did exactly what I went to community college because, college ain't going to accept you with a 1.6. And then I just stepped right in with the idea that if I reached one child in 10 years, I did much more than most. And then right away, you realize it's much more complex, much more beautiful and terrible than that. And I just fell in love with the relationships I built with my students, the community that I decided to move into in order to be close to the first school building I worked into. And ever since then, I've just been involved in, taking the practice and the lessons I've learned being a teacher to the real world and using those skills to discuss complex ideas in ways where folks can truly engage with them in a real way.
Man, I appreciate it. I especially love the fact that you talked about, I loved education. I just didn't like school. I have an English teacher in my building, my freshman English teacher, Mr. Polo, shout out to you. He says the same thing. He is a phenomenal educator. And he even tells the kids to this day, I hate school because I hate, the limitations and the structures that are so often put in that space that limit what can become. And so that's one of the reasons why he's in that space, trying to break some of those molds. So kudos to you, kudos to him. I'm just really excited that you were like, hey, you know what? School wasn't for me. It didn't do that thing. But here I am making impacts, changing the world one kid at a time. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, definitely. And I think that I was thinking about this earlier, education's not a job for people who just want a job. It's a way of being, it's a way of life. And I think coming into education like that and then building networks with like-minded individuals is really advanced where I'm even at right now today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We were just talking about that the other day at work, that this is a craft, right? And that those individuals who come in and that just view it as that, just view it as a job, tell me what to do. Like, you're not going to last. That's when you get tired. That's when you get burnt out. Like, this is a craft that you curate, right? It is a specialty. You know, I have a daughter in culinary school, right? It's a craft, right? You learn the recipe, but then you make it your own in the same way, you know, what we do in education. So I'm curious, like, what is it that you want to jump into tonight? Because I know you mentioned a few things, and I'm like, man, I'm excited to see where this is going to go.
Well, of course, we can't ignore the times that we're living in
Mm-hmm.
right now. I know several folks already are being very concerned about uh, this type of work being stopped and limited, especially parts of nonprofits, if you're part of the National Park Service, even. And these type of things are real, and elections have consequences. But I think it also speaks to kind of the lack of direction that as a society that we're engaged in right now. No reason why we find ourselves in 2025 kind of relitigating the issues that were discussed during Reconstruction. I always like to remind people that tons of white Southerners called it reverse racism by allowing Black people to run for Congress and be in state houses and have the right to vote. And this type of rhetoric is still being used today, where
Mm-hmm.
folks are arguing, oh, well, that there's more discrimination against whites than other groups, and those other groups are DEI and da da da. So when you're thinking of it, I think the historical understanding becomes an issue within a society where there's this grand narrative that is pumped to us. And I think that right now we're in the beginning of Black History Month, the 99th year since Carter G. Woodson started. Next year is the 100th year, and we got plans around that. But the 99th year since this man whose parents were enslaved, and he got a PhD in history and realized that it's very important that folks understand their history and not from someone else's perspective, and set out and made that happen as a teacher, creating
Mm-hmm.
whole networks for other teachers to access the material. And even today, our students are celebrating Black History Month every year, yet never hear of this man's name. And I think that's the nuance in which we need to focus on when we're even talking about kind of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And in this society, we like to believe that we're inherently on the side, the arc of justice bends, to take King's words. But at the same time, we got to bend that, bro. We got to be
Mm-hmm.
engaged in the process. We can't sit around and think that that's just going to happen naturally if we go to work every day, check off the boxes, and follow the rules.
Man, I love that. I was like, man, did he listen to the last episode? Because I literally just was talking about that, right? In one of the last Pause to Ponders, that about that arc of justice and challenging and asking people, like, what are you doing to make that bend? Because you're right, it doesn't just happen. And something you said I think resonates with me is that, like, if we don't know our history, right, they oftentimes say we're doomed to repeat it. And you're right, we consistently spout out these narratives, these beliefs, right? We just retell these same stories without oftentimes knowing where we came from. And I worry sometimes, I'm in Chicago, I'm in the west side of Chicago. And oftentimes I look at my kids and I'm like, you have no idea the shoulders upon which you stand. Right. And it frustrates me and bothers me as we try to educate to say, hey, listen, like the things that you're taking for granted right now were not just given, right? The sacrifices that were made, you do not understand it. And so therefore you don't appreciate it. And so I'm glad that you're bringing this idea up of this history, this true history, this comprehensive and holistic history that is being challenged right now, is being threatened within our government. And I mean, man, it's literally, the recording of this is February 4th, right? So it's only been about 2 weeks and things have been chaos already. And so I'm just glad that you're bringing this up.
Yeah, man. And just to double down really quick on King, one thing I notice when I speak to students, and during Black History Month, I'm invited uh, to different places to speak about it. And one thing I always ask folks, number one, who started Black History Month, nobody really knows who does. And then if somebody does say somebody, they say King, and which is very interesting. And then I asked them, well, how long did King live after he gave the I Have a Dream speech? And many people, oh, like a week, a day, they associate right after he gave that speech, the famous one, I've been to the mountaintop, that he was assassinated. Well, that was 5 years after the I Have a Dream speech. And I try to bring that out because a lot of people flatten that narrative, flatten the fact that when he was assassinated, only 40% of African Americans had a positive opinion of him, let alone the majority of the country, which kind of like looked at him as something that was a threat that needs to be silenced, that he was not doing good for his people. I think about Whitney Young in the Urban League saying that nonsense back in the day. So when we look at it now, it's like they show a statue in DC of him, but we never talk to the kids about who financed that statue. Who were the major contributors? Walmart, JP Morgan, and Boeing. There's even a commercial I remember they showed with a little black girl with an American flag walking, looking at his picture and looking at it and feeling proud, and it says next president. And it's freaking Boeing, one of the largest manufacturers of weapons. And I think, like, what would King think? And see, like, those are the nuances that have been flattened, not just from his legacy, but even just the when they put Malcolm and him as diametrically opposed, when both of them reached the same conclusion at the end of their lives. You know, Martin had to learn that not all white people are good, and Malcolm had to learn that some white people are okay. But like, they did get to that point. But we don't teach that. We teach that they were ones for violence, like that's some ridiculousness, and ones for nonviolence. And when we teach our kids this and then emphasize slavery, because slavery is white people's history, how people survived is black history, that switches the whole narrative. And I don't think we do that enough in the society. And I think we give too much credence to a grand narrative that is really based and built off of anti-blackness and difference of groups who do not fit into that box.
Man, you know, Ish, when you started talking, the very first thing that came to mind, I was like, so you mean that whole my friend Martin? Like, right? Like, let's pastoralize, right? Let's romanticize this narrative. And you're right, because if I can convince you that this individual that you might view as a hero was X, Y, and Z, then maybe you'll emulate that. And I hope that you do, because if you emulate some of the other characteristics that he represented, right, that we don't talk about, like you were just pointing out, you know, that, you know, the militant Malcolm represented, then it's like, oh dear, like, what is that going to mean for us? What is that going to mean for the systems and agendas that have been put into place? So no, let's feed this other narrative, right? Let's create this, you know, background, this history that starts with slavery, because that's all, you know, that background is, right? And it's like, all right, we've got songs, we made it up, and you should be happy we're good now. So I'm curious, because you and I are sitting here and we're like, no, I mean, I'm sure you didn't learn it that way in school. I didn't learn that in school. And yet we are here having this conversation. So why do you think that so oftentimes that our students are brought up, right, in the same space that I am right now, that I'm frustrated to say, hey, yo, this is not the true history. Let's dive in. Let's talk about it. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think that it takes some radical individuals who might be perceived as, you know, just, you know, way out of left field? Like, why does it take that in order to deliver these truths to our young people today?
Well, I mean, that's the intellectual genealogy of a lot of folks that actually were about freedom. You know, one thing I always said is, like, are we talking about the God of Harriet Tubman, or are we talking about the God of George Washington? Because supposedly they worship the same God, but what was Harriet Tubman praying for compared to what George Washington was praying for, the slave owner? And that is the fundamental, like, paradox of this society. So, like, I always think that, like, America has always been like fascist, if not borderline fascist. And the only thing that really stopped it at times and really challenged it and opened it up for other people were Black people pushing against the system for all people. You know, even talks right now where they're talking about, you know, birthright citizenship. You know what I mean? Like, that was because of formerly enslaved people. But at the same time, formerly enslaved people at the time weren't telling, you know, Chinese immigrants that your child born here couldn't be a U.S. citizen. Unfortunately, we got some people like that now, but, you know, like Carter G. Woodson said, you can always find a Negro against abolition and for segregation. So when we're talking about this larger reality, we get to a point where the kids are going to turn it off because they know in their gut that you're frauding. They know that something's wrong and you're not speaking to what's wrong. You're speaking to what you think they need to hear in order to become good citizens or check off a box or, wake up at the ass crack of dawn to go to jobs that treat them like trash and and tell them there's nothing you can do about it. When you talk to the youth today, that's how they feel half the time. Like, there ain't nothing I could do about this. It's just the way it is. I want to get mine, and have adopted that F you pay me mind state that the society is based upon, have adopted some of the values that have underlined really just the functionality of how America operates. And we used to have that tradition of, no, like, that's wrong. But like, by doing that, you are a villain in this society when you're alive. You are a bad guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think, right? So I remember watching, I'm sure the comedian Hassan Minaj, right? Like, I remember watching a special, and this was like right before the election, all of those things happened. And I remember watching it, and he was joking, and he was talking about like, hey, you know what? It's okay. Take advantage of me. Do what you want to me, as long as you put that money in my pocket, right? And I was just like, that there's something about those statements that hurt, right? Fast forward a little bit later, I remember having conversations with my students, and they were like, well, hey, yeah, we don't mind voting for Trump because he gave us stimulus checks. And I was like, whoa. Like, first of all, that isn't how that happened. And second of all, like, are you really okay sacrificing all the things that are about to come through for just a little change in your pocket? Right? But like you said, it's that mindset of, let me get mine. This is the way the world is. So if that's all that it's ever going to be, if that's all it ever was, then hey, at least let me get paid and have a little bit of fun in the process. Which I'm just like, y'all, there's so much more to this, and you have so much more power than you realize.
Yes, and that's not on accident. I think that when you really think about how education functions, the boxes, the way that it is not encouraged for educators like us to be speaking truth to kids, that there is this quiet, like, either missionary feeling from too many folks in the classroom that's very based on paternalism, and another that looks at the kids with disdain and that they're unable to do things. And then we turn around and be like, well, what's wrong with you? It's your fault that you won't make it. And that is also internalized by students to believe the things about themselves that our society portrays of them, especially if we're talking about Black and brown children. And, I think of like a Derek Bell quote, and I think we forgot this wisdom. You know what I mean? It's very important, this wisdom that our ancestors and ancestors of color in this society have developed and cultivated over generations. Derek Bell once said, slavery is an example of what America has done and a constant reminder of what white America might do. And we forget that. Like, it isn't all good. And I think a lot of folks have gotten comfortable with the way things are, but these victories were only temporary. And not only are they only temporary, we're getting to the situation now where you actually see the wealth gap rising. You see folks still being discriminated in housing, even if you hold for credit and wealth. We have a bunch of clowns running around telling kids that you could be the next Elon Musk, when there's only one of them dudes, and he's he's very rich, but his parents were also emerald miners in South Africa. And they stole land from, his ancestors stole land from folks in South Africa that now they don't even want to give back, right? And so, like, these ideas, students aren't exposed to if we don't go, educators go out our way, but how many of us are actually doing that? So when in those 18 states passed laws before, right, in the last attack and wave of against CRT, that wasn't being taught. Shoot, half the time that the folks don't even know what that even represents. But just the threat, just the idea that someone might focus on justice is enough to pass laws and claim, oh my God, you're making my child feel uncomfortable. Or we can't focus on Tulsa because that brings up old feelings we need to get over and move around, when not still addressing the base issues that created the issue to begin with.
Yeah, I always love that one. Like, you're gonna make my child feel uncomfortable. Like, you don't think that anybody else feels uncomfortable with entire swaths of their history and their realities being erased, minimized, romanticized. And so I'm sure, like, I'll be honest, like, for those of you like watching, like, with the way things are going, I'm very curious how this episode is going to be received by everyone else out there. And so, if this is the last episode, no, I'm joking, but I'm curious for people listening to this, right? Especially Ish, and you started off with the beginning of this saying, right now, considering the current climate of the country, I'm sure there are people listening to this and saying, yeah, you know what, I agree with you, but I'm worried. Right there was just conversations about weaponizing the DOJ against educators who support trans students, and that's something as simple as I'm going to use your pronouns, right? And I was like, I guess I'm going to jail, right? Like, so there are these laws, these things being passed that says even this conversation that you and I are having shouldn't be taking place, right? And yet here we are saying, hey, screw it. This is the conversation that needs to take place. Just because you don't want the histories to be told doesn't mean that they are going to be silenced. So people who are listening, watching, however they're accessing this right now, what are some recommendations for them if they want to maybe better understand? Maybe they're listening and saying, some of these things that you all are saying, I had no idea. How could they deepen their understanding so they can contribute to this work? If they just want to push back, if they want to challenge and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to stand up and push back regardless. Do you have any ideas, suggestion, resources?
Oh, yeah, of course. Number one, I want to suggest Fugitive Pedagogy by Dr. Jarvis Givens, Carl G. Woodson, and The Art of Black Teaching. I mean, that is just a lesson of what folks used to do when they weren't allowed to teach that. And they were heavily monitored. But guess what? They still taught it. They still developed networks with one another. During the enslavement period, people used to teach each other to read in pits in the woods. So like this idea that like somehow like some fundamental thing is being taken away from us, number one, we should need to get rid of the idea that it's been given to us and then accept the responsibility of us facing it. So I think that's a great place to start if you're an educator and you're really concerned about what's happening. But then I would also say there's different roles for different people. Like for me, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. I can't put back the words I say and pretend I don't believe what I believe and I've always fought for. Even when I was a child, I knew I was a tolerable deviant to a lot of people. Oh, that's just Ishmael. And I became a threat when I started to, wait a minute. You don't know what you're talking about, bruh, because this, that, and the other. And I think it's very important that folks understand there's going to be different roles for different people. So if you're in a position, it's not being reckless to speak truth, but at the same time, if you're uncomfortable speaking truth and you want to be more strategic, do it, but don't sell out the people who are speaking the truth. Do what you do to build community with other people. Don't post everything on social media on the plans that you're having with folks in order to really build community. And I think that is super important. But there will be folks who should put that on social media in order to encourage other people not to be afraid. And I think that's the key point because fear is a real thing, y'all. Don't get it twisted. Like, am I worried about potentially like not being able to provide for my 4 boys at one point because I get fired on some stuff associated with this? I mean, that's a fear. But like my wife said, she said, I'm 10 toes down with you no matter what happens. Just don't be scary. And that's what we need from our leaders. That's what we need from our teachers. That's what we need from our neighbors. That's what we have to do for people who actually say they care about humanity. Because if you aren't doing this, if you're not aware of these things, could you even be a good person in this society? And I really want to challenge people with that. Can you be a good person in this society if you don't know these histories, if you don't go out your way to learn them and engage with other people in learning them? And it's not that we'll reach the same conclusions, but what conclusions are you reaching and what is fed into it? And so I definitely want to suggest that book. I want to suggest Amos Wilson's The Falsification of African Consciousness, because he goes into how history is portrayed to people and how that causes them to interpret it in a certain type of way. Obviously, Martin King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I mean, like, I'm surprised I didn't hear about that book till I was 27. And I love Black history since a little child. I would also say all the education books like Education of Blacks in the South, see what people did to build schools, even if they were only getting like $500 from the Rosenwood Fund and the school cost $2,000. Guess what? Sharecroppers put that money together. They're pennies together. in order to make that happen so they can have something for their children, a potential better life, even if that potential better life was limited by the very society in which you go into. So that radical imagination is much needed, especially now. And, it's not just here in America, right? We're in the existential crisis environmentally. There's wars everywhere, rumors of war everywhere. And we need to stop sugarcoating it and pretend like all we got to do is just like re-elect or elect, Vice President Harris. That's why our youth are like, this is ridiculous. And then they're going to respect more of somebody speaking the truth, even if that truth is not in their interest, because they know the other person's straight frauding. That is just a real rough reality that I think not enough people are being honest when we're looking at it.
Man, I appreciate, when I know they couldn't see me when you were doing it, but when you mentioned fugitive pedagogy, I immediately looked. I've got 2 copies right over here, and I had a thought. So, I will say this: when this episode drops, when you're listening to it within that week, what I want you to do is I want you to either tag the show, either share something, right? Because we just talked about putting this information out there. Just share an aha moment, something that you've learned, or maybe a radical way that you are planning to stand up and push back. And so within a week, I'll choose one of you. I got a couple copies over here. I will send them out to you just to say, hey, you know what? We're not just talking about this. I want you to read. I want you to understand. So just know that. And so, it's just, as you were talking, something came to mind. Like, I remember not too long ago as I was getting into this work, and there were a lot of people who were like, I want to talk about equity. I want to talk about DEI, right? And it was like a buzzword, right? In fact, one of the workshops that I run is like beyond the hashtag, because so many people are quick. It's that performative allyship. It looks good. It sounds good. It feels good. I'm going to do all the things. Look at me, look at me, look at me. But then when shit hits the fan, right? And I've always been saying this, when it hits, where are you going to be? And I think this is that moment, right? Because like we're saying that people are literally like, I have some speaking gigs coming up, and they're like, are you still gonna present? Yes. Because that is who I am, that is who I have been. And this right now gives an opportunity to figure out who's actually going to be standing there, right? Who wasn't just performative, who wasn't just jumping on the bandwagon, who wasn't just doing all the talk so that way they could get a paycheck or get all the likes or the followers or whatever it might be, because this is the time that work is going to matter. And you're right. This may be a decision maker for many of us and many of the things that we do. But if this is something that we say are core values, these are things that we say are our internal beliefs, then you cannot just waver on that. Because if you can waver, if you could walk away and say that this thing is no longer important, then guess what? That was never a core value. Right, that was that performative allyship. That was, and I really, to be honest, there's a part of me that cannot wait to see who's left standing, right? Because this is that moment, like, all right, everybody's abandoning ship. The few, the true, the proud, we're going to be standing here, right? I think about, my guy Reef out there in Philadelphia, right, and all the things coming against him, and he's just like, listen, I'm trying to make sure that we take care of our own because clearly nobody else wants to. Right. And he's being attacked and ridiculed and dragged through the mud. And he's like, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm trying to make sure that we are taken care of. Right. But still doing that work. So, Reef, if you're listening, shout out to you guys. But yeah, I just want to say thank you. Like, I always, like, these shows go by so quickly. And it feels like we could sit here for an hour, 2, 3, 4. There might have to be a part 2. Right. It might come from a cell somewhere, but we'll do it anyway. But listen, I just want to say thank you. Before we jump off, I just want to find out, like, how can people find you? How can people listen to you? How can they connect? Because you are clearly a wealth of knowledge. You are clearly a source of inspiration. So how can people find you?
Well, I appreciate that, brother. If you do the professional thing, you can just put my name on the LinkedIn, John, it will come up. I don't think there's too many folks with my name like that in Philadelphia. And also Instagram at ishx19. Definitely put all the proper propaganda stuff on there when it comes to what gives me nourishment, but also the opportunities. I actually do a Africana Studies lecture and workshop series that's open to anybody who wants to tune in. So you can find information on those pages about that and those other opportunities that are coming up. The semi-quincentennial is next year, right? the
Yeah.
250 year. In Philadelphia, that's a huge thing. But one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on are the invisible architects of freedom, who actually was about that life. And then we're not talking about that pedophile who wrote all men are created equal. We're talking about the folks who took those words and said, okay, you say that, let's see that, let's see if that's true. And folks did that repeatedly, even if it meant putting themselves in trouble. So that's how I would say, you know, you can connect with me. Definitely, if you're ever at BMAC at Sharif's, John, he told me earlier they already started planning for next year's conference, which is just crazy. But like, just if you're about this work, I know we're going to connect, and I appreciate this space, and I appreciate the ability to get in some good trouble, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. I love getting into good trouble with like-minded individuals, so I appreciate you. I'm hoping that our paths connect in person, and I'm sure that they will sometime soon. So I just want to say thank you, obviously, for being on the show. I told y'all that this was going to be a hot one. So I just want to say thank you for being on here, but more importantly, just thank you for the work that you're doing. We need more people like you. I know we're going to need you in the future. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all of you listening, all of you watching, I just want to say, make sure that you are listening. I know that this was riled up. I know that you could feel the passion. You could feel the fire. But as we said in the opening moves on this, this is the time, right? We were able to sit in a space of comfort. We were able to sit in a space of saying, hey, we can talk about this, but be okay, because it was kind of on the fringes, but that is not the case anymore. So please make sure that you are not just listening, not just watching, but you are going out and doing, and connecting with individuals like Ish are going to help you make sure that that can happen. So I just want to say thank you for all of you to be in this space, and always, until next time.